Well, thank you, worship team, for leading us this morning. And it is good to see everybody, churchONE. Good to see you again this Sunday. Happy Easter, and I mean that intentionally because really, according to the church calendar, Easter is a season. It's not just a day. We obviously have Easter Sunday, in which we celebrate uniquely the resurrection of Christ, but Easter in the church calendar is actually a 3 to 4 week season. And it really is a season in which we mark, as a church, kind of that first Easter when the first disciples made the transition from seeing and being with Jesus, to faith. What is it like to make that transition from seeing to faith? And the church has always sort of marked that in the Gospels and in the book of Acts, and it's good to mark it because we actually are on the faith side of the equation. We enter in at the end of the story. And probably one of the most famous people in that mark of transition from seeing to faith was this guy, Thomas, right? Thomas is one of the 12 apostles or 12 disciples. Thomas is always getting in trouble for asking the obvious, right? And for sort of speaking his mind and bringing up the tough questions. Now, Thomas happens to get a bad rap because Thomas also was the first one to understand that Jesus was, in fact, more than a man. He was God. Thomas was also the first one to make the commitment as a disciple that he was willing to die for Jesus. And tradition says that Thomas was the one that brought the gospel to India. But at the end of John's gospel, we probably have Thomas's most famous moment. And it's the reading that we have this morning. And I'm gonna read it. You should have these handouts, right? And if you're at all like me, you cannot read them without glasses. But we are going to read in John chapter 20. And we're going to skip down. So the first 19 to 23 is Jesus coming to the upper room on the first Sunday, Easter Sunday, to the disciples and sort of saying, peace be with them, and giving them a charge. And Thomas happened to not be there that Sunday. So let that just be a warning to you right there, right? Like, miss a church on Sunday, you might miss something big, right? And Thomas missed it. He wasn't there, right? And so we pick it up in verse 24. It says this: "But Thomas, who was called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, 'We have seen the Lord.' But he said to them, 'Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands, and put my finger in the mark of the nails and my hand in his side, I will not believe.' A week later, his disciples were again in the house, and Thomas was with them. So he learned his lesson. He showed up at church the next Sunday. Although the doors were shut, Jesus came and stood among them and said, 'Peace be with you.' Then he said to Thomas, 'Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe.' Thomas answered him, 'My Lord and my God.' Jesus said to him, 'Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet come to believe.' Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name." So it's easy to get drawn into the doubt of Thomas, this great doubting moment of like, I'm not going to believe it until I see it, and I understand that. But I'd like to peel away a layer of that, and I'd like to look at something, a certain affirmation that Thomas brought, a certain reminder that Thomas brought to all of the 12, a certain post-Easter reality that I think it is good for all of us to think about. When Thomas was told that Jesus had risen from the grave, and in the rush of excitement that the disciples had, Thomas made an affirmation that we all ought to hold on to, and here it is. Thomas looked at his disciples and he said this, I don't know what kind of man you are planning on worshiping. I don't know what kind of Lord you have, but one thing I know, my Lord has scars. My Lord has scars. And I will not worship a God without scars. I mean, stop and think about it. Think about what he could have said, what he could have asked for. And again, I think we have this particular verse up there. It says, but Thomas, called the twins, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So he said to his disciples, we have seen the Lord. But he said to them, unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands and put my finger in the mark of the nails and my hand in his side, I will not believe. Think of all the things he could have asked for, right? He's like, hey man, unless I see that hair, right? I don't know about you, but every Jesus movie I've seen, Jesus has great hair. Do you ever notice that? Or he could have said, man, unless I see the hair, I'm not going to believe. Or he could have said, unless I see some more miracles, right? I'm not going to believe. And unless I hear him teach again, I'm not going to believe. But no, Thomas asked to see the scars. It's easy, is it not, post-Easter to want to have a Jesus without scars? We want a nice Jesus. We want an in-control Jesus. We want a miracle-working Jesus. We want a powerful Jesus. But there in the midst of all of that and all of those other affirmations, we cannot forget that we have a Jesus with scars. We've gotten used to it, We've gotten kind of used to it. Now the cross is a decorative thing. But back then, the cross was a thing of incredible shame. In fact, the Apostle Paul, when he was talking about the cross of Christ in Romans chapter 1, says this, I am not ashamed of the cross of Christ. And you think to yourself, now why would he say that? Is he ashamed to be a Christian or whatever? Is he kind of ashamed of his religion? Is that why? No, why? He says, I am not ashamed because you know what? Most people would have been ashamed of a cross. A cross, according to Fleming Rutledge in her great book on the crucifixion, the amazing thing about the cross of Christ is how irreligious it was. It was a sign of common execution. It was an ultimate thing in humiliation. It was a sign of weakness and defeat. It wasn't a great moment. It was a scar-producing moment. But Thomas says, I don't know what kind of God we're supposed to worship, but if the God that you're asking me to worship does not bear the scars, then I cannot worship him. It's easy to forget this, but we live in a world, right? Maybe it's not so easy. I should stop that, Maybe it's easy to remember this and it's hard to believe. But we live in a world where something has gone terribly wrong and needs to be put right. That is the nature of the world that we live in. We live in a world where the unrighteousness of this world needs to be pushed out by the righteousness of God. 1 Peter 3:18 says that in the sense that God sent the righteous Jesus to drive the unrighteousness of this world out. And there is actually a collision course between the unright of this world and the right of God, and that collision causes scars. Even when I see, I don't think we think of this word righteousness the way we ought to. It's kind of one of these words that you probably only hear in church, right? But really the way that the early New Testament writers understood righteousness, it was making something that was broken fixed again. Taking something that was bad and overwhelming it with good. They saw, I think rightly so, righteous as a verb. Not some theological noun, but like a force. The image that came to my mind, and this shows the depth of my character, is the movie Finding Nemo. Do you guys remember the turtles that got caught up in the transatlantic whatever current it was, and Nemo and Dora, is that it? Yeah, hook up with Dory, hook up with them, and they're riding along in the the current, right? And as they jump out of the current, and the turtles are just being pushed farther and faster by this current. Do you remember what the turtle was yelling? Righteous, righteous. And I think he was experiencing like the force of being moved, right? Being moved by something powerful. Listen, here's one of the realities of life, and here's one of the realities of Scripture, that God is on the side of the oppressed. One of the reasons that Jesus died a common criminal's death, exploited by the religious and political authorities of the day, is that Jesus was making a stand, letting himself be seen with the outcasts, the broken down, the worn out, the ones that got the bad breaks, because God is on the side of the oppressed. And Jesus is actively making right where things went wrong. But here's where the trick comes in. It is very difficult to punish the wrong ones. And here's why. Because the good guys and the bad guys keep switching sides. Think about it this way. The obvious illustration I have is parenting. I have multiple kids, right? And say one of my kids is like picking on one of my other kids or saying something mean. And I turn to kid number one and I say, would you please stop picking on your sister, right? And I say, stop it, right? And just as I'm about to inflict a little righteousness on kid number one, kid number two, who has been previously picked on and whom I'm trying to defend, suddenly whacks kid number one, right? And so I have to turn to kid number two and say, would you stop whacking your brother? Stop it. And before I turn back to kid number one, he elbows kid number two, right? The good, the oppressed, and the oppressor keep switching sides. Life works a lot like that. I think one of the things we have to think about is like, sometimes I lack advantages, but sometimes I actively take advantage of what I've got. There are some times where the stone rolls over on me, and there are other times where I sit atop the stone and I roll over somebody else. So if I say Jesus is actively on the side of the oppressed, well, whose side is he on? Who will he punish and who will he bless? If you think that is an easy solution, an easy thing to answer, I would argue that you have not looked deeply enough into your own soul. And this is what's amazing, is that Jesus says, you know how I'm going to stop this whole thing? I am going to punish myself. Me who is righteous, me the one who has done no wrong, me the one who deserves no punishment, will take the condemnation and the punishment upon myself. And hence the scars. And I think Thomas is dead on when he says, look, church, I don't know what kind of Easter Jesus you want, but here's what I want you to know. My God has scars. Because my God is bringing forth righteousness, and that takes scars. But there's another, I think, important aspect of just looking at the scars of Jesus, and that is simply this. Whether you're righteous or unrighteous, one of the realities of life is that life has a way of making scars. Try as we might, life never seems to work perfectly, Am I the only one who notices that? This is kind of a lighthearted, stupid illustration, but all my life, I have grown up like really good friends with the Kelly family, right? And if you've ever been around Calvert Hall, it's hard not to know who the Kelly family is, right? And they were always really great athletes, and I was always really an average athlete. And they're great people, but every once in a while I thought, I wish I was just like a little better athlete. Why did they get all the glory and I just have to sit here on the side? Well, sure enough, my friend David Kelly adopts a little boy from Ethiopia, and I adopt a little boy from Korea. And the two of them are the same age, and they're playing football at Cambridge School where they go to school. And I turn to my little Korean boy and I say, hey, when you play football, who plays quarterback? And he says, Iyasu Kelly. And I thought, for crying out loud, like even when I go out of my gene pool and he goes out of his gene pool, he gets the quarterback. Like, why is that? Like, why? Right? Look, that's a lighthearted thing, but I think all of us, if we're honest, like we have our scars, right? Why did my marriage fail? Why is my kid struggling? Why is my job not working out and that guy's job is? On Good Friday, Anne, I think, brought a tremendous challenge to us when she encouraged us when she said that some of the bravest people she knows are the ones that have the courage to admit that life is not working. Addictions, injustice, pain, anger, broken relationships, confusion, frustration, money problems. We have scars. And we have a Jesus who bore the weight of the world upon his shoulders, and it scarred him. It scarred him. Maybe Thomas did us all a favor when he basically said, look, I can't buy this whole God being human mystery unless I see the scars, unless I know that he knows that what it is like to stumble under the weight of this world. I cannot worship a God. I cannot have a high priest who does not sympathize with my own weaknesses. Have you asked Jesus to see your scars, to show you his scars lately? Maybe you should. Maybe you should. Maybe you should show him some of your scars. I had a couple of losses this week at work, right? You ever have those? Like just the meeting doesn't go right, the money doesn't come in. It's not tragic. You didn't lose your job, but you just lost. You just lost. The ball doesn't bounce your way. You tried your best. You could have maybe done some things differently, but not much bit differently. But for whatever reason, you lost. Hey, Jesus, could you show me your scars again? Could you remind me that you understand? Last night, we're having some work done on our house, and it creates all this. It's a beautiful thing, and I'm grateful for it. And I know it's a first world problem, but it creates tension, And like between Ann and I, and last night I should have kept my mouth shut, shouldn't have said something, but it was like a force inside of me. I just couldn't hold back, and I said something I shouldn't have said, and like my unrighteousness gets poured out on my wife. Hey, Jesus, right? Can you show me your scars again? Can you remind me again that it is your righteousness that's going to overcome my unrighteousness? And I love how Jesus responds, and I think we have this verse as well, I think. Because he does show Thomas his scars. He says, he shows up the next Sunday, right? And he says to Thomas, put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hands and put it in my side. But then he ends with this, like, don't doubt, but believe. Like, look, Thomas, I get it. You needed to see the scars, and I get that. But don't forget that these scars, Thomas, are also on a resurrected body. Our sin, right, is not the final thing about us. Our unrighteousness is not the final say. It's the righteousness of Christ that is ultimately true. Our weights, our burdens can be the very thing that instead of crushing us, they can make us who they are, but only if they are just a part of us, not all of us, right? The scars are vitally important. Jesus understands this, but I think he wants Thomas to see something powerful. And I think this is what he wants us to see. Because remember what I said. We're in the season now where we're making this transition from seeing right to faith. And I think one of the things that Jesus is saying is that, Thomas, like, now is the time to trust me. To trust me. You know, to actually trust, to like believe, you know, that there's something bigger than this. You know, this story adds an affirmation, and I love it, and it's really an affirmation for us. When he ends, he says, Thomas, like, you know, like Thomas says, my Lord and my God, and he bows down to worship him, and Jesus, you know, receives it, right? But then he says, hey, Thomas, listen, this is what I want you to know. This is what and I think Jesus right now, honestly, I think in this portion of the scripture, he is speaking to all of us because we're in this stage. He says, you believe because you saw, but blessed are those who believe and do not see. You know, what the word blessed doesn't mean you're like religious or anything. It just means you're good. You're good. And why are you good when you believe because you can't see? Well, what kind of people believe what they can't see? People that trust. That's what trust is. Right? You've ever done, you know, you've seen those trust exercises where you fall backwards and you trust the people behind you are going to catch you. The whole point is like you don't see them, right? You trust. Jesus is saying that blessed are those who believe and do not see, not because, you know, they figured it all out or they've got it all right. No, they've learned to trust Jesus with their scars. You know? Just yesterday, I was saying to Ann, I'm like, I am tired. And I'm a little just tired of the religion thing, you know? Tired of preaching. I don't feel like doing it. And I really appreciate what Ann said. She's like, all right, here's what you got to do. You just got to sit with Jesus. Just sit with him. Just tell him you're tired. Tell him you don't feel like doing it. Show him your scars. And I did. And I was blessed. And you can be too. Thomas didn't want a God without scars, and we don't have a God without scars. And blessed are all of us who learn how to trust in a Jesus with scars. Let's pray. Lord, I thank you for this season where we transition from seeing to faith, and I thank you for your scars. By your stripes, the Bible says, we all are healed. There is healing in those scars. Healing for sin. Healing for the brokenness of this world. Lord, may everyone here this morning experience in some small way the healing presence of the scars. Thank you for Thomas. Thank you for what he asked for. Thank you that you are a Jesus with scars. it is well with our souls because of these scars.